Abel. Abel aims up, and he brings his best to the table. That's a good thing to think about in relationship to the date. The man who's there with the woman that he has an interest in could aim up and bring his best to the table. That's one strategy. Cain, by contrast, offers what's second rate. Well, you can understand that in the confines of your own life. You could imagine that, first of all, you could imagine aiming up or not. That's easy to imagine. Sometimes you're aiming up and sometimes you're not. And then even independent of that, to some degree, is how much sacrificial effort you're willing to put into the attempt, right? Because you could imagine at the best times of your life that you were all in. You put your best on the table. You hit it with everything you had. And perhaps, if you were fortunate, the consequence of that was that you had some success commensurate with your effort. Or alternatively, you could take the variant route and you could pull the wool over your eyes and the eyes of your fellow men and God himself, and you could bring what was second rate to the table, presuming that the ease that allows, if the effort was successful, would justify the deception. And that's what people do who bring what's second rate to the table. They make the prideful presumption that the offering of what is less than is best will be sufficient. And it's a foolish notion because a moment's reflection informs everyone that life is far too challenging and difficult for anything but everything you have to be enough. And so what happens to Cain is that he fails. And he could fail and learn. Because you can fail and learn, and then the next time you don't fail quite as much, or maybe even you partially succeed, and you can keep doing that. You have to do that. You do that if you have some humility, right? Because you note your failure, you presume that maybe, you've got some sorting out to do. You make the sacrifice necessary to sort yourself out, and you start walking however awkwardly and poorly uphill. Cain doesn't do that. He gets resentful instead. And he gets resentful enough to call out God. Now, people do this all the time, and it's understandable. There'll be times in your life, for example, where something dreadful happens. Someone you love becomes seriously ill, for example, and seems entirely unfair. Perhaps I'm not making a suggestion that it isn't in this case. And you're so upset, disheartened by that you lose faith. Not only do you lose faith in yourself and in existence, but you see within you emerge a strong proclivity to shake your hand at the sky and curse. And that's what happens to Cain, although with much less provocation, right? He's bitter because he made second-rate sacrifices and they were rejected. He's not bitter because life itself has an element of arbitrariness and misery associated with it. And so he has a little chat with God, because that's the sort of guy Cain is. It's not his fault that he isn't proceeding happily in the world like his undeserving, successful brother Abel. It's, whose fault is it? Well, obviously the creator of all things. And so he has it out with God, and he says, essentially, I'm paraphrasing the story, as a consequence of familiarizing myself with multiple translations, he says something like, what sort of cosmos did you create here? I'm breaking myself in half, which is a complete lie, trying to get ahead, and nothing's working out for me, and I've got my brother, and no matter where he goes, the sun shines on him, and everything's perfectly bloody delightful. It's like, how do you account for that? That's the spirit of resentment, orienting his aim. And God says, if you did well, you'd be accepted. That's actually kind of a definition, It's an interesting definition, because the the impetus there is that if things aren't working out for you, in the most fundamental sense, that's on you. Now, you might think that's a pretty dreadful judgment. It's like, yeah, it's not as dreadful as the alternative, because if you're miserable because the cosmos itself is structured badly and set against you, well, you must as well just throw in the towel now. But if it turns out that there's some stupid thing you're doing, no matter how trivial, that's tilted you in a direction that you shouldn't be going, and you could be on your knees with sufficient humility to discover it, there might be the possibility that you could set it right and start wandering uphill instead of farther down. And that's essentially what God suggests to Cain, but he's already possessed, so to speak, as we'll see, and that's just not going anywhere. And then God says something even worse to him, and that's not so good, because what's already been said is not good. He says to him, if you did well, you'd be accepted, and you've brought what's insufficient to the table, and that accounts for your misery. And more than that, sin crouches at your door like a predatory, sexually aroused animal. And you've invited it in to have its way with you. It's a brutal metaphor, and it's a very interesting one. So sin is an archery term. It has to do with aim. To sin is to miss the target. 3 different languages. Greek is hamartia. It means to miss the center of the target. It means you can miss by not aiming, or you can miss by not being skillful, or you can miss by aiming in the wrong direction, or not aiming at all. To sin means to miss the target. Sin crouches at your door, the temptation to miss the target, and you invited it in. So what does that mean? It's not like you're possessed exactly by the spirit of resentment. It's not like it visited you by some accident while you were unaware. For something like that to gain control of your aim, you have to open the door and invite it in. And so that's what God tells Cain. It's you're miserable in account of your failure, but you're resentful and bitter and unhappy because you invited that spirit to take possession of you. And then it's worse than that even, because it's not exactly possession. You know, you might think, well, you're kind of naive and you don't know what you're doing, and you open the door and something comes in, so to speak, and now it's in you, and that's it's got you. And in a sense, you're innocent in proportion to your naivety. But that isn't what God tells Cain. He says, you invited it in to have its way with you. It's a sexual metaphor. And what it means is that God accuses Cain of inviting in the spirit of resentment and entering into a creative relationship with it, brooding on it, right? Brooding on resentment. People do this all the time. They're angry, they're unhappy, they fantasize about revenge, they fantasize about how the world has treated them brutally, they fantasize about what they could do to all those people who did them wrong if they only had the opportunity. They dwell on that, they revel in it, they brood on it, maybe for thousands of hours. If you ever wonder how someone gets to the point when they're 15 that they can take a high-powered automatic rifle and shoot up an elementary school, that's how. Couple thousand hours of brooding, and you'll end up in one hell of a dark place. Right, and so that's the pattern of Cain. And God tells Cain all that, and you can bet that doesn't make him very happy, because it's exactly the last thing he wants to hear. Right? Your failure is to be laid at your own feet. You've multiplied your failure by the invitation you offered to sin, which you conspired with to magnify your bitterness, and that's all on you. So what happens to Cain? He kills Abel, right? He destroys his own ideal, and he does that to shake his fist at God. And Cain says, my punishment is more than I can bear, which is always the case for someone who destroys his own ideal, because how are you going to live without an ideal? You've got nothing to aim at. You've got no pathway forward. You've severed your tie with everything that could give you hope. You're done. But that isn't where the story ends. Cain's descendants become genocidal. Right? And so that's a story of how, what would you say? Second-rate sacrifices open the door to a creative union with sin. That expands into fratricidal murder and morphs into the genocidal impulse. And the next story is the flood.